It was a late night in early November, one of those shifts where the air feels heavy and quiet enough that even your own breathing sounds too loud. I'd been working nights for years, but this one stuck with me. The roads were empty, the streetlights flickered every few poles, and the radio had been silent for almost an hour. The kind of night that makes you start noticing little things. The hum of your engine, the smell of stale coffee in your thermos, the soft rattle from something loose in the dashboard. I was alone in the cruiser, driving a stretch of highway that cut through the industrial edge of town. It was the kind of area full of storage lots, old warehouses, and half-abandoned factories that never really shut down but never seemed alive either. Around 2:40 a.m., dispatch put out a call about a stalled vehicle on the access road behind the old mill. No distress call, just a local trucker who'd spotted a car with its hazards on, parked half off the road. I figured it'd be a quick assist. Maybe someone ran out of gas, maybe just a dead battery. I was only a few miles out, so I said I'd take it. As I turned onto that access road, the light from my high beams stretched across cracked pavement and weeds growing through the asphalt. The area was pitch black except for the faint orange glow of the mill security lights in the distance. The car came into view after a minute. A small silver sedan, parked at an angle like it had drifted to a stop. Both hazard lights were blinking, reflecting off the guardrail. I slowed down, pulled in behind it, and left my headlights on. Even before I stepped out, something about the scene felt off. The driver's door was slightly open, just a few inches, and the front tires were turned sharply like whoever was driving had swerved suddenly. I noticed mud splattered high up along the side panels, like the car had left the pavement and come back again. My first thought was maybe someone had hit an animal or spun out. The area was known for deer crossing at night. I got out, the cold air hitting me right away. It was one of those damp chills that sinks through your jacket. The only sounds were the soft clicking of the car's hazards and the distant hum of machinery from the mill. I walked up to the car slowly, keeping my flashlight low. The beam cut through the steam rising from the hood. The engine was still warm. Inside, the seats were empty. No one in the front, no one in the back. I leaned a little closer, shining my light inside. There was a cell phone on the driver's seat, still lit up with a low battery warning. The keys were in the ignition but turned off. A jacket was draped over the passenger seat, and on the floor was a plastic cup spilled over, sticky liquid dried around it. Everything else looked untouched. I looked around. The road stretched straight for about half a mile before curving behind a cluster of trees. To the right was an open field leading to the chain-link fence of the mill property. To the left, a shallow ditch and a narrow trail that ran alongside a drainage pipe. It looked like someone could have walked that way, maybe heading for help. I followed that trail with my light. The ground was soft and showed footprints, one set, heading away from the car. They looked fresh, pressed deep into the mud, like someone had been moving fast. I radioed in my location, gave a quick update, then started following the prints. The trail led about 50 yards before dipping into a darker stretch lined with tall weeds. The ground got wetter, softer. The prints became harder to follow, but I could still see them under the beam of my light. I kept walking, listening to the squish of my boots, my breath clouding in the cold. There was something about the stillness that made me uneasy. Even the usual night sounds, crickets, distant traffic, dogs barking, were gone. I found a small clearing after a while. There were signs of someone slipping. A scuffed patch of mud, bent weeds, and what looked like drag marks heading toward the edge of the ditch. I followed them down. My flashlight caught something pale against the mud. A hand. I stepped closer and saw the body of a young man lying face down in the ditch water. His clothes matched what I'd seen in the car, dark jeans, a gray hoodie. He couldn't have been there long. The water hadn't even started to freeze over him. His face was turned halfway toward the bank, his mouth partly open, one shoe missing. I checked for a pulse out of instinct, but he was gone. His skin was cold, his body stiffening. The back of his hoodie was torn, and there was a dark stain that looked like dried blood spreading from his shoulder down his side. Not a clean wound, more like he'd been slashed or cut deep. I scanned the area for any weapon or sign of struggle but found nothing. Just the quiet field, the wind, and the faint sound of dripping water somewhere down the ditch. I backed out, radioed it in as a possible homicide, and waited for backup. While waiting, I started circling the area, scanning with my light. That's when I noticed something strange. A second set of footprints. These ones weren't deep like the first set. They were lighter, more careful, like someone walking slowly, following. The stride was wider, longer. They came from the opposite direction, stopped near where the man fell, and then turned back toward the trees. When the others arrived, they took over the scene, taped off the area, and started working. I stayed behind, watching the direction those prints had gone. The tracks led through the brush and disappeared near the back fence of the mill property. We checked the cameras later, but none of them pointed that way. Whoever had been there knew the blind spots. The investigation went on for weeks. Turned out the man in the ditch was 25, local, worked night shifts at a shipping yard. His car had been registered under his name. They found defensive wounds on his hands. He'd fought back. But they never found a weapon, and there were no witnesses, no cameras that caught anything useful. Months later, I still thought about that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The open car door, the flickering hazards, the footprints leading away into the dark. Felt like I'd shown up just minutes too late. Whoever did it was gone before I even turned onto that road. What haunted me most wasn't the body itself, but how normal everything had looked from a distance. Just a car with flashing lights. Something you'd pass without thinking twice if you didn't stop. That's the thing about working nights. Danger hides in ordinary scenes. You get used to it, but some nights remind you just how quickly normal can turn into something else. After a while, the case went cold. Every few months, I checked the file, hoping for an update. None ever came. No arrests, no suspects, just a set of muddy footprints that disappeared behind a fence. Even now, whenever I patrol late at night and see a stalled car with hazards on, I feel that same quiet dread settle in my chest. I think about how that man must have sat there in the dark, waiting, maybe realizing too late that whoever had followed him wasn't there to help. The job teaches you a lot about people, how fear shows up in silence, how quick it can all end, and how many stories are left unfinished because someone vanished into the night before anyone knew to look. That stretch of road still looks the same every time I pass it. But I can't drive it without seeing that flickering light in the distance, hearing the soft tick of hazard lights echo through the cold air, and wondering how close I really was to the person who walked away unseen. Because in the end, that's what sticks with me. Not what I found, but what I didn't. The set of prints leading back into the trees, light and deliberate, fading into the dirt like they belonged to someone who had done this before and knew exactly how to disappear. It was one of those shifts that dragged on slow enough to make you feel every second. I was working nights again, a Wednesday in late October. The air had that cold bite that sneaks up once the sun's been gone for a while. The streets were mostly empty, just a few trucks passing through town and the occasional pair of headlights way off in the distance. It was my 10th year on the force, and I'd seen my share of strange calls. Domestic disputes, accidents, people losing it on drugs, but nothing that sat in my mind the way that night did. Started with a call that came in just after midnight. A 911 hang-up from a payphone at a rest stop off Highway 8. No one on the line, just a few seconds of background noise before it cut out. The dispatcher tried calling back, but of course, payphones don't take calls. Usually those are nothing. Kids messing around or someone accidentally hitting the receiver, but we had to check it out anyway. I was the only unit close, so it fell to me. The rest stop was a small one, about 15 miles from the nearest town. Just 2 vending machines, a set of restrooms, and a handful of picnic tables. There were no attendants or security cameras. It was surrounded by pine trees on all sides, and at night it felt completely isolated. I'd stopped there a few times myself during long shifts, and even during the day, it had that strange quiet that makes you keep your guard up. I pulled in around 12:30. The parking lot was empty except for one pickup truck parked near the restroom building. The lights inside the truck were off, no movement. The only sound was the low hum of the soda machine and the steady wind through the trees. I left my headlights on and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The payphone was off to the side near a small wooden signboard with faded park rules. The receiver was hanging loose, swaying slightly in the breeze. I picked it up, listened. Nothing but a faint static. I hung it back up and scanned around with my flashlight. The ground near the phone had fresh footprints in the dirt, leading toward the picnic tables. I followed them, the beam of my light bouncing off the benches and the concrete trash bins. There were 2 sets of prints, one lighter, smaller, and one heavier, with deep treads that looked like work boots. They went around one of the tables, then veered off toward the tree line. I turned back toward the restrooms to check the truck. It was an old blue Ford, plates from the next county over. I walked up to the driver's side window and shone my light inside. The keys were still in the ignition, and on the passenger seat was a fast food cup, half empty, and a phone charger plugged into a lighter socket. No sign of anyone. I went to the building next. The door to the men's restroom was closed, the women's door propped open. The lights were on inside, buzzing weakly. The smell hit me before I even stepped in. That sour, musty odor of a place that hadn't been cleaned in a long time. I moved through each stall, scanning with my light, checking corners. Empty. The sink had a smear of something dark on the porcelain, but it looked more like old dirt than blood. When I came out, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint noise, maybe 50 feet away, past the trees. It sounded like metal scraping lightly against something, then stopping. I froze for a second, listening. It came again, faint and uneven, like someone dragging something across gravel. I followed the sound, moving past the edge of the lot and into the woods. The air was colder there, stiller, and my flashlight beam seemed weaker against the trees. The ground sloped downward, and I could see a narrow path, probably made by people cutting through the woods to reach the highway. The footprints I'd seen earlier seemed to go that way too. About 30 yards in, I found a patch of flattened grass, like someone had been sitting or lying there recently. There was a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. Red plaid, looked like part of a shirt. I moved my light slowly around the ground and saw what looked like drag marks. 2 parallel lines in the dirt, leading further down the slope. I followed them, keeping my breathing steady. The smell of damp earth grew stronger, mixed with something else I couldn't place at first. Metallic, sharp. The marks led to a small clearing where the ground opened up into a shallow ditch filled with muddy water. At the edge of it, half covered by dead leaves, was a shape. It was a man, lying face up, his shirt torn and stained. He looked to be in his 40s, maybe older, his eyes half open, skin pale in the light. There was blood on his chest, dark and soaked through the fabric. I could see a large cut near his collarbone, deep enough that it must have been fatal. His hands were still clenched, and beside him was a knife, half buried in the mud. I crouched down, checked for a pulse even though I already knew. Nothing. His body was cold. The knife handle was worn, probably his own. There were signs of a struggle, broken branches nearby, more footprints leading back toward the lot. But what caught my attention most were the smaller prints, the same ones I'd seen earlier. They circled the area, stopping near the ditch, and then turned back toward the rest stop. Whoever it was hadn't run. They'd walked calmly away. I called it in backup and medical, then stayed by the body until the others arrived. The forest was dead silent again, like even the wind had stopped. When the first units showed up, I pointed out the trail and the prints. We followed them back up to the parking lot, where they stopped near the pickup truck. That's when we found a wallet on the ground beside the driver's side door. It belonged to the man in the ditch. His name was Richard Donnelly, address from 2 counties over. The truck was registered to him. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. The strange thing was what we found next. About 20 feet from the truck, near the vending machines, there was another vehicle. A small white sedan that hadn't been there when I arrived. His engine was still warm, lights off. Inside were a few grocery bags, a purse, and an open map with the rest stop circled in red ink. The registration matched a woman named Lisa Donnelly, his wife. We didn't find her that night. The area was searched for 2 days straight with dogs and drones. Every inch of forest, every ditch, every abandoned building within 5 miles. Nothing. When they examined Richard's body, they found defensive wounds, meaning he'd fought. but the blood on the knife was his alone. The assumption was that his wife had been with him and something had gone wrong. A fight, panic, maybe self-defense. But the prints told a different story. Hers, the smaller ones, had never shown signs of running. They followed his path calmly, lingered near the body, and then went back to the parking lot. There was even a partial print on the truck door, like she'd leaned against it for a moment before walking away. No one ever found her. The case went cold within a few months. The truck was impounded, the sedan too. Her fingerprints matched, but there was no trace of where she'd gone. I still remember the way that Rest Stop looked that night. The blinking light above the bathrooms, the phone receiver swaying in the wind, and that faint metallic smell that lingered in the trees. Every time I pass that exit now, I slow down a little, even though I tell myself I shouldn't. The payphone was removed years ago, but the concrete pad is still there, and people still stop to use the rest area. They don't know what happened there. Most never will. For me, it's not the sight of the body or the blood that stays with me. It's the quiet, the calm way those smaller footprints trailed off into the darkness, leaving no trace of panic. Just a straight path through the mud, disappearing into the trees like whoever made them knew exactly where they were going and why. That night taught me something I never forgot. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's calm, patient, and quiet enough to walk away barefoot from a scene like that, leaving only footprints and questions that will never be answered. I worked in a small-town police department in the Midwest for nearly 12 years before I decided I'd had enough. Most of the time, things were calm. We handled bar fights, drunk drivers, the occasional domestic dispute, and every now and then, a burglary or missing person case that took a few days to sort out. The area was surrounded by farmland and forest, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, and nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. That's what I used to think. It was late September, the air just starting to turn cold, the nights longer than they had been a few weeks before. I was working the night shift, partnered with a newer officer who had transferred in a few months earlier. We'd been sitting in the cruiser near the edge of town, watching for speeders. It was a quiet night, no calls for hours, just the radio crackling every now and then with routine check-ins from nearby counties. Around 2:15 a.m., dispatch came over the radio, reporting that a local farmer had called in about strange lights near his property line. He said it looked like a car might have gone off the back road that cut through the woods behind his cornfield. It wasn't unusual for people to lose control out there. The road was narrow, curved sharply, and had no lighting at all. We figured it was another drunk driver who'd ended up in a ditch. We headed out, following the route through the back roads. The cruiser's headlights stretched ahead, cutting through the dark, the gravel popping under the tires. When we reached the farmer's property, we saw faint tire tracks leading off the road into the field. There were no fresh skid marks, just a pair of deep ruts disappearing into the dark. I stepped out, the cold air biting against my face, and followed the tracks with my flashlight. The beam of light swung across rows of dry corn stalks and tall grass. I could hear crickets, the faint rustle of leaves, and the low hum of the cruiser's engine behind me. After a few yards, we saw it. A car half buried in the soft dirt. The front end was smashed, the windshield cracked, but the damage wasn't from a high-speed crash. It looked like whoever had been driving just rolled off the road slowly and stopped. The driver's side door was open. I shined my light inside. The interior was empty. No one in the front, no one in the back. The keys were still in the ignition. The headlights were off, but the dome light was glowing faintly, giving the car a pale yellow hue. There was a phone on the passenger seat, screen cracked, battery dead. We ran the plate number. It came back registered to a man named Robert Hastings, 38, from 2 towns over. No criminal record, nothing suspicious. Dispatch said there hadn't been any missing person reports for him. We figured maybe he got into a minor accident and decided to walk home or find help. Still, it didn't make sense. There were no nearby houses in that direction, just forest and empty farmland. We called for a tow truck and decided to look around until it arrived. I followed the edge of the cornfield toward the tree line while my partner circled the car, looking for footprints. The ground was soft from rain a few days earlier, and I could see shoe prints leading from the driver's door toward the woods. They were spaced unevenly, like the person had been stumbling or running. I followed them with my flashlight, scanning every few feet. The prints continued for maybe 30 yards, then stopped at the start of the forest. The trees there grew close together, their trunks like tall black pillars. I shined the light between them and saw broken branches, disturbed leaves, signs that someone had gone through in a hurry. I radioed my partner, told him I was going to check deeper in. He stayed near the car while I went in. The air was colder under the trees, and the smell changed. It had that heavy, damp forest scent mixed with something faintly metallic. The ground sloped downward slightly, soft under my boots. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint hum of wind brushing through the branches. About 50 feet in, I found a torn piece of fabric hanging from a low branch. It looked like it came from a jacket. I noted it mentally and kept moving, sweeping my light across the ground. There were more footprints ahead, scattered and erratic. Then, just beyond a patch of brush, I saw something shiny, a flashlight lying on its side, the beam pointing into the dirt. I picked it up. The light still worked. I could see mud smears on the handle and a streak of what looked like dried blood along the side. My gut started to tighten. This wasn't a simple walk for help anymore. Something had gone wrong. I kept moving, careful to note my surroundings so I could find my way back. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods got. Branches brushed my shoulders. The trees muffled the outside sounds until all I could hear was my own breathing. I found more signs of struggle about 100 yards in. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and what looked like drag marks leading toward a shallow ditch. When I aimed my light down, I saw a smear of dark stains along the dirt. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't been there long either. I crouched, touched it with a gloved finger, and knew immediately it was blood. I followed the drag marks another 20 or 30 feet. They ended near a fallen log where the ground flattened out. There, I saw something half covered in leaves, a shoe. It matched the tread pattern of the footprints earlier. The rest of the area looked disturbed, like there had been a struggle, but there was no body, no person, no more blood beyond that point. It was as if whoever had been there just vanished or had been carried farther out. I radioed for backup and requested a K9 unit. My partner joined me, and we marked the area with tape until the others arrived. The dogs picked up a scent right away and followed it deeper into the woods. We trailed behind, lights cutting through the dark. The scent led us nearly half a mile away before the dogs started circling a small clearing surrounded by thick brush. In the center of that clearing, we found a large metal door lying flat on the ground, half buried under dirt and leaves. It looked like some kind of old storm shelter or root cellar, the kind you see on farms. The handle was rusted, but it had been used recently. Fresh scrape marks were visible around the latch. We pulled it open. The smell that came out was strong, damp, moldy, with something foul mixed in. There was a narrow set of concrete steps leading down. I went first, my flashlight beam shaking slightly as I descended. The air grew heavier and colder. At the bottom, there was a small room with concrete walls and no windows. The floor was packed dirt. There were old tools scattered around, a broken chair, a few empty cans, and in the corner, a large metal barrel with dark stains along the rim. The walls had scratches on them, not words or carvings, just erratic lines, deep and uneven, as if someone had been clawing or scraping with a sharp object. I felt something sink in my chest as I looked around, realizing this wasn't a place anyone had used recently for storage. The barrel was half filled with water, dark and murky. I leaned closer, shining my light, and saw what looked like fabric floating near the top. I took a stick from the ground, stirred it gently, and the fabric shifted. That's when I saw the human hair. We backed away immediately and called for the coroner and detectives. By sunrise, the entire area was sealed off. They spent the next 2 days combing through that forest and the shelter. What they found inside that barrel was what was left of Robert Hastings. His car hadn't been stolen. He hadn't wandered off and gotten lost. Someone had taken him, dragged him into the woods and killed him not far from where he crashed. Later, Detectives traced the area to an abandoned property once owned by a man who had gone missing years earlier, a former farmhand with a violent record. They never found him, but they did find signs that someone had been living in that shelter for a long time. Food wrappers, clothing, and a small pile of personal items that didn't belong to one person. I still remember standing there that morning, watching the coroner load the body bag into the van. The sky was gray, and the wind cut through the cornfield, making the stalks rattle like dry bones. I'd seen plenty of ugly things during my career, but that night stuck with me differently. It wasn't the sight of what was found. It was the realization that this had been happening right under everyone's nose, out in those quiet woods behind the farms. After that case, I couldn't drive through that area the same way again. Every time I passed those back roads, I thought about that car, those footprints, and that door in the ground. I'd always believed that working in a small town meant safety, familiarity, predictability. But after that, I learned something I'll never forget. Evil doesn't need a big city or an audience. Sometimes, it hides in the quietest places, waiting for the right moment when no one's looking. That was the case that finally pushed me out of the force. I turned in my badge a few months later. I still live in the same town, but I stay away from the woods now. Every so often, I hear reports of hunters finding old campsites or strange things buried out there, and I know there's probably more no one's found yet. But I've stopped asking questions. Some things are better left buried. I worked as a police officer in a quiet Midwestern town for nearly 15 years. Most of what I dealt with was small stuff, minor thefts, noise complaints, the occasional bar fight. You get used to the same faces, the same roads, and the same routines. The calls become predictable after a while. You start to think you've seen everything that can happen in a small town. But there was one night that proved how wrong I was. It was the kind of night that slowly builds in your memory until every second is burned into your mind. It happened during the summer, a humid night when the air felt thick and heavy, and the roads shimmered slightly from leftover heat. My shift started at 6 p.m., and by midnight, nothing major had happened. I was alone that night, working the west side of town, which covered mostly farmland, a few warehouses, and a cluster of old houses scattered along a two-lane road that led toward the river. It was a quiet area, too quiet most nights. At around 12:45 a.m., dispatch came through with a call from a truck driver who said he'd seen a car parked on the shoulder of Route 19 with its hazard lights blinking. He said it had been sitting there for at least 30 minutes. Normally, we'd get a few of those each month. People running out of gas, falling asleep behind the wheel, or just broken down. Still, protocol said we had to check it out. When I reached Route 19, I spotted the car almost immediately. It was a dark blue sedan pulled halfway onto the shoulder, one tire in the grass. The hazard lights blinked steadily, casting a dull orange glow across the road every few seconds. I pulled up behind it, turned on my spotlight, and stepped out of the cruiser. The night air hit me like a damp blanket. Crickets hummed all around, and in the distance, I could hear the faint rush of the river. The first thing I noticed was that the driver's door was open, just slightly ajar. The headlights were off, but the dome light inside was glowing faintly. I walked closer, flashlight in hand. The car was still running, the low hum of the engine blending into the sounds of the night. There was no one in the driver's seat. Inside, there was a purse on the passenger seat, a phone charger plugged in, and a half-empty bottle of water in the cup holder. The car looked clean, organized. I checked the registration. It belonged to a woman named Amanda Pierce, 32, from 2 towns over. Her license and registration were still inside the glove compartment. What caught my eye next were the footprints in the dirt beside the car. They led away from the shoulder, down a small embankment toward the tree line. The ground was uneven and slightly soft from rain earlier that day. The prints looked fresh. I followed them slowly, keeping my light low. They led into a patch of thick brush that bordered the woods. The grass there was bent and broken, and I could see signs that someone had moved through in a hurry. About 10 feet in, I found a shoe, just one, lying on its side, the heel bent. A woman's shoe. My gut tightened a bit, but I kept going, scanning the ground for more signs. The footprints continued deeper, now mixed with what looked like drag marks or scuffs in the soil. It was subtle but there. The kind of signs you learn to notice after years of looking at accident scenes and searches. After about 50 yards, I came across a small clearing. It was quiet there, too quiet. The crickets had gone silent, and all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint ticking of my flashlight button as my finger pressed against it. The beam of light swept across the clearing and landed on something small and metallic near the base of a tree. I walked closer and saw that it was a phone. The screen was cracked, and there was dried mud smeared across the back. I picked it up, checked for power, dead. I slipped it into an evidence bag and looked around again. The ground near the tree looked disturbed, patches of dirt lighter than the rest, like they'd been freshly dug or trampled. But there were no clear signs of blood or a struggle, just the faint outline of where someone might have knelt or sat. I radioed in my location and requested backup, marking the area on GPS. While I waited, I continued searching the perimeter of the clearing. About 20 feet away, I noticed a narrow path leading down toward the river. It looked like a trail made by animals or maybe by people who used to fish there. I followed it slowly, shining my light along the edges. When I got closer to the riverbank, I saw more footprints, 2 sets now. One matched the earlier prints, the other was larger, deeper. It looked like a man's boot. They led right down to the edge of the water, then stopped. I scanned up and down the shoreline, but there was nothing else. No more prints, no signs of anyone leaving in another direction. Just the soft sound of water moving past and the reflection of my light dancing on the surface. Backup arrived 20 minutes later, and we began a full search of the area. We called in a K-9 unit, divers, and more officers to sweep the woods. For hours, we combed through that area, from the roadside all the way down to the river. The divers found Amanda's body just before sunrise, about 30 feet downstream, caught between some branches near the riverbank. She was still wearing one shoe. It was clear from the start that it wasn't an accident. The medical examiner confirmed later she'd been strangled. There were bruises on her arms and defensive wounds on her hands. The boot prints belonged to someone else. The investigation stretched on for weeks. We interviewed everyone who might have seen her car that night, checked nearby cameras, searched through cell records, but nothing useful came up. No eyewitnesses, no clear suspect, no reason. She had no enemies, no known issues, nothing that suggested why someone would do that. A few months passed, and the case went cold. I still patrolled that same area often, always slowing down near the spot where we'd found her car. Every time I saw those hazard lights flashing in my memory, I'd feel the same unease I did that first night. About 8 months later, in early spring, another call came through. This time it was a truck driver again. Same stretch of Route 19, same time of night, another car parked on the shoulder with hazard lights blinking. I remember my stomach dropping when dispatch read it out. I drove there fast, hoping it was just a coincidence. When I arrived, it was almost identical. The car pulled halfway onto the shoulder, hazards on, engine running, driver's door open. But this time, the car belonged to a man. His wallet was still inside, and his phone lay face down on the ground outside the car. Screen cracked. Footprints again, leading into the same woods. We called everyone immediately, no waiting this time. By the time we searched the woods, we found the man not far from where Amanda had been taken. Only this time he was alive. Barely. He'd been beaten badly, unconscious but breathing. He was taken to the hospital and eventually recovered. When he was able to speak, he told investigators he'd pulled over to make a phone call when a man approached from the woods. The stranger had flagged him down, claiming to need help, but before he could react, he was attacked. The attacker had dragged him toward the trees, but something must have scared him off before he finished the job. We ran the prints, DNA, and everything we could collect. Eventually, it matched a man who had been working seasonal jobs in the area, someone who'd been drifting from place to place, living in abandoned barns and underpasses. He was arrested 2 weeks later, sleeping behind an old warehouse just a few miles from town. When they brought him in, he didn't say anything. But in his bag, they found Amanda's missing jewelry, along with other items that connected him to a few unsolved cases in nearby towns. He'd been preying on people who pulled over late at night, people who thought they were just stopping for a moment. When the case closed, I thought I'd feel relief. I didn't. Every time I think about that night, I see the open car door, the blinking hazard lights, the quiet road with no one else around. I think about how easily anyone could have been the one to stop there, how it only took a few minutes for something like that to happen. After 20 years on the job, that case stayed with me more than anything else. It reminded me that even in the calmest, most predictable places, danger doesn't always look loud or obvious. Sometimes it sits quietly on the side of the road, lights flashing, waiting for someone to pull over and check. I still drive past that stretch every now and then. The road hasn't changed, but I can't look at it the same way anymore. I always keep moving now. I never stop on that shoulder, not even for a second, because I know what's out there when the night gets quiet, and I've seen what waits in the dark. I've been a police officer for almost 12 years now, and there are things I've seen that don't fade from your mind no matter how much time passes. Some nights blur together, but others leave a mark that you carry for the rest of your life. One of those nights happened during a late shift in early autumn, when the air had that dry chill that creeps into your bones and the streets get quiet enough to hear the hum of your own patrol car. I was working the night shift alone that week. My partner was on leave, so it was just me covering one of the quieter rural districts outside of town. Most calls out there were routine, noise complaints, suspicious vehicles parked by old barns, the occasional drunk driver trying to make it home. That night started the same way. I ran a few plates, checked on a car parked near an abandoned gas station, filled out some reports on my laptop. Nothing unusual. It was around 1:30 a.m. when the radio call came through. A welfare check at an old farmhouse on the edge of County Road 19. The dispatcher said someone had called in about a light flickering inside the house and what sounded like a child crying. The house belonged to a man named Walter Hensley, according to property records. 71 years old, lived alone, retired mechanic. No criminal record. The neighbor who reported it said Walter's truck hadn't moved for a few days, and no one had seen him outside. The house itself was about 4 miles off the main road, surrounded by empty fields and a stretch of woods that used to belong to a logging company decades ago. When I turned onto the gravel road leading up to the place, the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and there were no streetlights, just the narrow beam of my headlights cutting through the dust. The driveway was long, lined with dead cornstalks and tire ruts that looked half sunk into the mud. At the end sat the farmhouse, 2 stories, white paint peeling off, a broken porch light swinging slightly in the wind. There was one dim light visible through a downstairs window. I parked out front, turned off my headlights, and sat for a moment. The night was still except for the faint rustling of leaves and the ticking of my cooling engine. I could see the porch steps leaning to one side, the wood warped from years of rain. The front door was closed, but there were faint marks near the handle, like it had been opened recently. I radioed my location, stepped out of the car, and started up the path. My boots crunched on the gravel, loud in the quiet. When I reached the porch, I noticed how the boards sagged under my weight. The smell hit me then, not strong, but that faint, heavy scent of something rotting. I'd smelled it before at crash scenes and neglected houses. It was a smell that meant something wasn't right inside. I knocked on the door, waited, knocked again. Nothing. I walked around the side, checking the windows with my flashlight. The curtains were drawn except one, where I could see that the light came from a small lamp on a table. The rest of the room was dark, but something about the way the lamp flickered wasn't natural. It was erratic, like it was struggling for power. I moved toward the back, and that's when I saw the side door cracked open just an inch. The frame had fresh scratches around the latch, as if someone had forced it. The smell was stronger there. I pulled my flashlight up, pushed the door open with my foot, and stepped inside. The first thing I saw was a narrow kitchen. Old appliances, dusty counters, dishes in the sink. The air inside was thick and cold, and there was a faint buzzing sound from somewhere deeper in the house. The smell was almost overwhelming now. I could feel it in my throat. I followed the beam of my light through the kitchen, past a small dining table with an unfinished meal still sitting there. A plate with dried food, a fork beside it, and a cup half filled with what looked like coffee long turned cold. I reached the living room, and that's when I noticed the floor. It was covered in dark stains that spread out in uneven patches. At first, I thought it was old water damage, but when I crouched down, the smell told me otherwise. It was dried blood, a lot of it. The lamp on the table was flickering because one of the wires had been cut halfway through. There were drag marks leading across the floor toward the hallway. My stomach tightened. I followed the marks slowly, shining my light over the walls. There were scratches, deep, uneven ones, like someone had clawed or scraped against the wood in panic. They led down the hall and stopped at a closed door. The smell behind that door was unbearable. I didn't have to open it to know what I'd find, but procedure said I had to confirm. I covered my nose with my sleeve, turned the handle, and pushed it open. The beam of my flashlight hit what was left of a body slumped against the corner. The face was unrecognizable, but the clothes matched the description of Walter Hensley. His body was bloated and pale, and from the way his legs were twisted, he hadn't died easily. There were deep wounds on his arms and neck, jagged, not clean like a knife, more like tearing. I scanned the room. The bed was overturned, the nightstand broken, and the floor had smears where something had been dragged out, not in. The window on the far side was open, curtain flapping in the wind. The frame had splinters where it looked like someone had climbed out, maybe in a hurry. I checked around outside with my light, scanning the ground for footprints. There were tracks, but not boot prints. They were bare feet, small like a child's, but the stride was too long, the spacing wrong. I followed them toward the field behind the house. The grass was bent, showing a trail that led to a shed about 100 yards out. The shed was old, half collapsed, covered in vines. The door was barely hanging on its hinges. I pulled it open, and the smell hit me again. Blood, rot, and something metallic. Inside, the dirt floor was soaked dark in spots. There were tools scattered around, hammers, saws, a chain, and something that looked like homemade restraints bolted to the wall. But what stood out most were the photographs pinned along the boards. Dozens of them. Some were old, faded Polaroids showing what looked like random people, men, women, a few kids, all in the same yard behind this house. None of them looked happy. A few were bound. At that moment, I understood the depth of it. Walter hadn't been a victim. He'd been doing something here for a long time, and whoever made those bear tracks had ended it. Maybe someone escaped, maybe someone came back for revenge. There was no way to tell yet. I called it in, backup, coroner, detectives, the whole team. While waiting, I went back inside, just trying to piece together the timeline in my head. On the kitchen table, I found a small notebook half buried under a pile of mail. It had dates and short notes written in shaky handwriting. Times, initials, vague entries like picked up from market or no one noticed. The last entry was only 3 days old. That was around the time neighbors said they stopped seeing him. The final line was short and uneven. He's still in the shed. When the others finally arrived, they sealed the place off. I stayed outside by my patrol car, staring out toward the shed with its door still open, the wind moving the weeds around it. I couldn't stop thinking about those small footprints, the way they led from the window straight to the shed, never turning back. A few days later, the investigators told me they'd found DNA from multiple victims all over the property, but none matched the tracks outside. Whoever had killed Walter was still out there, someone who had known what he'd done. The case never turned into an arrest. No leads, no witnesses. It stayed open, marked as unresolved. I still patrol that area sometimes, even now. The farmhouse was torn down eventually, but I can't drive past that stretch of road without thinking about it. Every time I see the empty field, I picture that open window, the flickering light, the dark stains on the floor, and those tracks leading away into the dark. That night taught me that the worst things we find aren't always crimes of impulse or madness. Sometimes they're years of evil buried under normal life, hidden behind a quiet face and a tidy yard. And sometimes justice doesn't come from the law, it comes from something darker, something desperate that walks away barefoot through the dirt, leaving just enough behind to remind you what people are capable of. It's been over 6 years now, but when the wind shifts right, and I'm out on those back roads with nothing but the radio static for company. I swear I can still smell that faint, rotting air and see those small prints fading into the fields like whoever made them never really stopped walking.